Greetings YouTube, it's been far too long since I've had an opportunity to do a video, and I want to take a look back at the Fender Stratocaster that was made in Japan, E-Series 1984 to 1987. If you haven't seen the first video where I assess the guitar and kind of give an overview of the process, it might be of interest to watch that. I'll put a link to it in the description. So I wanted to go ahead and remove the neck from the body, and then just with a notch straight edge, measure the amount of curvature in the neck with no string tension on it, mainly just to see where it was, and check how tight the truss rod was, and then note how much it moves. So here is the first time I've put a screwdriver to this truss rod, and all I'm doing is tightening it about 1/8 of a turn. And just noting again with the notch straight edge, how much did that 1/8 of a turn affect this neck? And I was hoping to see that neck straighten, and it certainly did. The initial just feel of the truss rod was really good. And so I wanted to go ahead and back that truss rod nut out completely. So the basics of working on the truss rod involved cleaning the nut, soaking that in a little bit of solvent, getting in there and scrubbing with a Q-tip any sort of buffing compound, dirt, or debris that might prevent that truss rod nut from rotating smoothly. And I would use a dental pick to get in there and try to clean the threads, scrape at the threads without damaging them. Basically apply a little 3-in-1 oil to the threads of the nut and the rod, and a little bit of paste wax to the bearing face of the nut to just allow it to turn a little bit better. With the truss rod nut reinstalled, I tightened it until I felt it engage, and then I just wanted to check again with my notch straight edge to see where it was at, and I felt pretty good about it at this point. As I moved on to taking care of the frets, I wanted to go ahead and clean the fingerboard, because while it didn't have a lot of fret wear or pitting in the fret wire, the fingerboard wood itself was pretty dirty, and I usually will try to just clean that with a soft cloth and a little bit of elbow grease, but occasionally it just doesn't want to come off, and I'll choose a solvent like naphtha. And you should work in a well ventilated area, and I really should have been wearing gloves as I did this, but naphtha is a good degreaser, cleaner, and it's not going to dissolve anything that we need to be concerned about other than the dirt and the grime. It's not going to hurt the finish, it's not going to hurt the wood, it evaporates fairly quickly, so it's a good cleaner degreaser. And so I just went at that with a little bit of naphtha, a little bit of elbow grease, and some patience. I just wanted to get rid of that dirt and grime before I moved on to taping the fingerboard off and getting into the actual fretwork. Before I get into leveling the frets, I like to get the neck as straight as I possibly can, so that'll involve using a notch straight edge and some feeler gauges. I'll also give it a look visually just to see, get it as straight as I possibly can, and then I'll start leveling it. On this particular guitar, I chose the short fret leveler to allow me a little bit more flexibility as opposed to the longer fret leveler. I ink the top of the frets and I start working lengthwise. I'm not opposed to using radius blocks as I go along as well, but I know that on a tight 7 1/4 vintage style Fender radius, in the upper register of the neck, I like to work the middle of the frets just a little bit more to try to cut down on some of the noting out or fret buzz you get when you bend. A lot of people like to play blues and bend, and you'll find on a tight radius like that, it can be problematic at times. So early on in a fret dress, as the ink on top of the frets disappears, I will check with a fret rocker, because even if the ink is gone and I am able to find a little bit of rock, chances are that fret is loose. So I'll take the time to go back and stop what I'm doing and glue that fret back down if I suspect it's loose at all. You can have frets that are loose that you can't even see with your eye, but if you ink the top of the fret and you do some leveling and you have a fret rock after the ink is gone, that means most likely that fret is loose. So I just spent a little bit of time checking for rocking, doing a little bit of leveling. I use a pretty fine abrasive when I level the tops of standard fret wire, and just there's a lot more to doing a fret dress than I'll get into on the video here, and it's not something I would recommend for a do-it-yourselfer. I'm sure there are people that would disagree with that, but I've seen enough bad things happen to guitars where people didn't really know what they were doing, so I would leave it to a professional to take care of your fret leveling and crowning needs. A big part of any fret job is the crowning and shaping of the frets. In this instance on this guitar, there wasn't a lot of leveling that was needed because there wasn't a lot of pitting in the frets. I had about 40 to 42 thousandths in crown height, probably only took 3 to 4 thousandths of metal off the top. So it wasn't a major crowning job. Sometimes that's out of our control, but on this this particular guitar is pretty simple, pretty straightforward. And so any flat surface that I put on the top of the fret with the leveling process gets reshaped or crowned back into more of a round, leaving a little bit of a flat spot in the middle of the fret. And after that, I move on to sanding and refining that shape of the fret to get rid of any file marks from this particular file and leave a surface that's ready to be sanded and then polished. Once I'm done with the crowning process, I'll go in and sand and refine so that I have just a very slight flat spot on top of the fret that you can't even see when I'm done polishing out. And there's a lot of different ways to go about this, but this is what I'll do to get rid of the file scratches, which are about 300 grit somewhere in there. And then I'm going after it with about 500 here on the sides. I'm not trying to hit the very top, but I'll have to do both sides of the crown, get it reshaped, and this gives me a lot of control in that process. And there's a metal guard there to protect the board. And after I'm done refining all the landings, then it's time to go back and polish those out. Got to get rid of all the scratches. For polishing out frets, I've really come to like these micro mesh pads. They have a little bit of cushion. It allows me to get in there around the fret crown and really polish it out to whatever grit the customer might like. Or, you can have a really high sheen, almost a mirror shine, or you can stop somewhere short of the finest grit. But I don't use steel wool. I don't like the little shards of metal, and this neck is detached from the body, but any little steel wool shaving could get onto a pickup, get under the pickup cover, and make its way through the coil, which could be disaster. And so I don't really use steel wool on guitars for any reason anymore. So the micro mesh pads are really, really nice, and I have a little guard there to prevent putting cross grain scratches in the wood, which is another rookie mistake, amateur mistake to make. I do not want to see cross grain scratches in the wood. It looks terrible. Moving on to the bridge, it did have a fair amount of light surface rust, and before I adjusted any of the height adjustments or intonations to disassemble this bridge, I wanted to just pre-treat it a little bit with some light oil. Also, in those small string height adjustment screws over the years can build up a lot of crud, dirt, probably skin, grime. And before I try turning an Allen wrench in one of those, I want to make sure that it's cleaned out, and a dental pick works really well for getting in there and cleaning those out. So just on an old bridge like this where I don't want to strip apart, I don't want to ruin anything, get in there and just put a little bit of oil on there. And this particular stuff has a fine tip applicator, which works really, really well. As I got ready to remove the bridge, I needed to get in and take the tension off of the springs, and I was really impressed to see no oxidation, no surface rust, nothing other than factory buffing compound in that route. While I have no way of knowing for sure if it has never been removed, it sure seemed that way. There were no marks from screwdrivers or anything like that in the screws, so I want to take the tension off these springs before I try to remove them. Otherwise, they tend to go flying across the room, and I never use a plier to try to remove those because you're almost guaranteed to slip and scratch the finish. So I'll take the tension off of these springs and then go ahead and lift them out of there and go back to the face of the guitar to remove the screws on there and lift the bridge out, because I want to completely disassemble, soak the parts, and get rid of this surface rust. To finally remove the bridge from the guitar, I need to remove the 6 screws on a vintage Strat style bridge. The springs are already off of there, and so once I have these 6 screws out, I can lift this bridge carefully out of the guitar. Every single part of the bridge is going to get soaked and cleaned and then oiled and reassembled. So I just want to be careful not to strip the screw, not to slip and scratch the finish, and just get that bridge off of there and get everything soaking. By pre-treating all of the threads of the screws, this bridge came apart just fine. I didn't have any issues with things getting stuck, and you never know with a bridge or parts like this that are really, really old what you're going to run into. With the saddles off of the bridge, it's really quite easy to get underneath there and make sure that I'm applying oil right where the metal screw goes through that stamped steel saddle. Before I turn those screws, it's so easy to strip those and damage those if you're not careful on an old instrument like this. So just a little bit of pre-treating before I try turning those, making sure that the Allen wrench is all the way in, making sure that I have the correct size Allen wrench to avoid damaging those parts. In detailing one of these vintage style Strat bridges, the holes that are in that bridge plate can sometimes have burrs and rough edges, and that can contribute to strings breaking as they come through that plate and bend towards the saddle. So I like to get in there and carefully sand that. I like to take care of flattening out that spring block and the underside of that plate. Just one little
step in the process that can contribute to better playability and not breaking so many strings. After the parts have had a chance to soak in some solvent and oil, I'll carefully remove those and get ready to clean the surface off. After the parts come out and they're dried off, I go ahead and making sure that I have the right size Allen wrench, get in there and gently check to see if the part wants to turn. If it doesn't, I would hit it with a little bit more oil and let it soak a little bit longer, but these started to come out just fine. For the threads of the screw, I really do like this small green file cleaning brush. I believe I got that from Stuart McDonald, and it really works well to get into the threads where there might be potential rust, dirt, grime, crud. And I do that on all 12 of the height adjustment screws, and then I go through and I do the same process, especially anywhere I see rust, on the intonation screws. I want to get all those threads nice and clean before I reassemble everything so I can get the rust off of there and then keep it oiled and try to prevent the rust from getting any worse. There was quite a bit of rust on the very inside curve of this stamped steel saddle where the intonation screw comes in. So I took a little bit of Mitchell abrasive cord and got in there and scrubbed that. And then I double checked it and I kind of used a file to hold the abrasive cord in there flat and take a little bit more of that off of there. Just want to try to remove any rust I can see and do this to all the saddles, in addition to addressing any burrs that can happen where the string travels through the saddle. So I do like the little micro mesh sanding sticks to get in there and take surface rust off and just clean it up. And it's a fine enough abrasive that it'll kind of polish it up really, really nice. I don't want to take any plating off. I don't want to be overly aggressive. I do not attempt to make these look brand new. They're old, but I can clean those up enough to make them look good. Now, if this were a really high-end vintage instrument, I might not do any of this. I don't want to alter it, but this is certainly not a high-end valuable instrument, and I don't mind just cleaning that up. As a player, I've always found the stamped steel saddles on vintage style Stratocaster bridges to be a little bit problematic when bending. I tend to, if I'm playing a show, start breaking strings by the second set of the night unless I go through and detail the saddle. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm going through with the abrasive cord, trying to deburr that, and then a small fine mini file to try to just feel, as I'm moving this file back and forth, just try to feel if there's a burr there and then soften it up. Now, if you go overboard, you'll just create a new sharp edge. Some people will use a Dremel to deburr that. I don't bother with that, but just because I can feel where the burrs are with the file, I'll tend to get in there and pick those off and then sand those smooth with the abrasive cord, and it works pretty darn well. The same sort of process is done to the bridge plate that mounts to the spring block, and with that I found can greatly increase the life of the strings. As part of the continuing bridge process, the underside surface of that bridge pivots along the body, and I usually, if I detail a bridge like this, will soften that slightly and also flatten the underside of that plate where the spring block attaches to it. Again, if it was a really high-end old vintage Strat, I wouldn't do this. I want the metal on metal contact to be as much as possible, and I want that pivot action to be a little bit smoother on the body, and then deburr any little burr that can happen anywhere. But nice flat coupling between the plate and the bridge spring block. You want to check the different heights of these saddle height adjustment screws. Some guitars they'll all be the same height, and other guitars they won't. So before I bother to reassemble, I just look through those, and you can measure them with a caliper or whatever, but I just did it by eye here to make sure that I had an idea of where they go. As I reassemble, I'm going to put one of those small screws in the saddle, and then I'm going to hit it with a little bit more oil and using an Allen wrench go through and thread it all the way through so the threads, the oil that's on the threads of the screw can get into the saddle, and I'll adjust it up and down until it just feels nice and smooth. As I put the bridge back together, again made sure all the saddle height screws were in the right place, but I also just made it a point to throw a very light coat of paste wax on the threads for the intonation screws and then run them through the saddles. Anything that I may have missed along the way of cleaning up the rust shouldn't be an issue once I have a light coating of paste wax on there. So just use a Q-tip and lightly coat the threads, and then the bridge is pretty much back together, and at that point of the process it was time to turn my attention to the electronics. When it came time to looking at the selector switch, I knew that I could simply replace the switch. That's a no-brainer, but I decided to start by disconnecting the pickup wires and then getting in there and disconnecting the tone sends, followed by the jumper that connects one side of the switch to the other. And then I decided to take the switch off, and when you want to do that, you can simply lift off that switch cap. That's not a big deal. Unscrew the two mounting screws, and the switch should lift right off of there, unless of course you forget a ground wire, as I did, that was still connected to the switch, and then I had to get back in there and just disconnect that before I could get a close look at the switch itself. With the switch out, I was able to just take a glance, and it looked to me like two little screws would disconnect the plastic housing from the metal, and I could get a look at inside. The metal plate for the switch was bent, and it was also a little bit scratchy, but it wasn't too bad. So with two screws out, I was able to lift out the metal plate and expose the little circuit board in there with the traces on there, and a simple mechanical movement that rides along those traces that are connected to the lugs. So I wanted to go ahead and clean that, but then first, before I even got to that, I decided to put a sheet metal vice grip on the switch and just try to bend it straight. If it broke, I knew I'd be in for replacing the switch, but it was bent, so I decided to give that a shot. I did have to take the contacts off of the actual moving lever before I clamped it, and I was just holding two pieces together there with the clamp, and then grabbing it with a sheet metal vice grip to try to straighten out that lever nice and gentle, putting the end of the vice grip kind of where the bend seemed to be, bend it back straight, and maybe I even went a little too far and bent it back, but I wanted to be careful not to break that metal. I knew I could replace the switch, that's easy, but I thought it would be nice to just see if I could fix the original and make it work, and it turned out really, really well. As long as the switch was apart, I knew it crackled just a little bit, and I didn't want to have to come back and do this again, so I just hit it with a little bit of contact cleaner, both the movable contacts and the board itself, and then just wiped it dry. I didn't want to leave it wet inside of there. Just clean it off really well. I usually do that twice. Went ahead to this switch, got it done twice, reassembled it, and got ready to wire it back in the guitar in hopes that all of the problems would be solved by the time it was all said and done. Before putting everything back together, I wanted to go ahead and make sure the switch was working in case I needed to do anything else, so I wanted to give it a listen. And sure enough, that fixed the problem. I also want to make sure before I put everything back together that I go ahead and clean the potentiometers. Not a bad idea to hit them with compressed air first and then the cleaning solution. These weren't too bad. By the time I actually got through with the other bit of work, I didn't hear any more scratching to the potentiometers, but it's open, so I might as well get in there and clean it, and then it should be really all set to go to reassemble. I wanted to clean the surface rust off of the pole pieces. The pole pieces were flush to the plastic pickup covers. I had to be very, very careful removing that cover. It's very easy to damage the finish and start wires. If you try this on your own and screw that up, you're gonna have a dead pickup. I took a micro mesh sanding stick and very carefully and very lightly just knocked off the surface rust from the pole pieces. The magnets on these pickups are underneath these metal pole pieces, so I was just lightly cleaning them up. Did not want to hit the yellow plastic of the pickup covers. If you're totally inexperienced in working on guitars, I would not try this, because the wire that gets wrapped around the bobbin of the pickup is no thicker than a human hair, and if you don't know what you're doing, you can very easily ruin your pickup. So I just got in there and scrubbed them and repeated that process for each pickup, each pole piece, and I did take the pickguard screws and soak those in a little bit of solvent and end up cleaning those up as well, because some of them had a lot of surface rust. So this was just a cosmetic touch-up to make them look a little bit better. Once the bridge was reassembled, I mounted it back to the guitar. These 6 screws here mount the bridge to the guitar, but you can't crank them all the way down or the bridge can't pivot. So what I like to do is bring the head of the screw down to the bridge and then back them all out a quarter of a turn and just feel and make sure that it can pivot. Some people will use feeler gauges for that, which is not a bad approach, but I'll just bring it till the head of the screw touches the metal of the bridge and then back it off about a quarter of a turn, and that usually gives me the clearance I need for the bridge to pivot. When I'm doing a setup, I do like to tension the tuning machine buttons and also make sure that they're tight on the headstock. Some guitars will have a press-in bushing, and so you can't do this, but with these, there's a nut and a washer on the face of the headstock, and I like to snug those down. You don't want to over-tighten these or you can crack, damage, or lift the finish, but I don't want the washer underneath there rattling at a certain frequency and causing a buzz that sounds strange, so I just make sure that they're snugged down to the face of the headstock. Also make sure any mounting screw on the back of the tuning machines is tightened, and then I'll go along each button of the tuning machine, and if they have a screw holding them on, you can usually adjust that for tension. How does it feel to rotate that? I like to have a little bit of resistance there, and I like that all of the tuning machines match in terms of their feel. Not one really loose, one really tight, another one in between. I want to make sure that they all feel the same. If there's a little bit of resistance, just make sure it's solid. If it's really loose, eventually that screw could vibrate and fall out, and I don't want that to happen. So I just adjust each of them if possible. Not all tuning machines have that, but I like to check it and make sure it's good to go. Kind of winding down on the video here, but before I restring a guitar, I like to wipe down any area under where the strings will be, just because it's easier. So I'll just take a minute to wipe down the bridge, the pickup areas, the pick guard, and then of course go through and clean up the fingerboard and the frets. I've been handling the guitar quite a bit. There might be fingerprints on the frets, so I just want to clean that up as best I can. And then it's time to go ahead and get the guitar restrung and get on with the setup work. If I've done a complete disassembly and detailing of a bridge, when I string it back up, it's not going to play well at all. And I will just by eye go through and rough in the string height. When a saddle has two adjustments for height, I like to make sure that the saddles are parallel to the bridge, unless it's a 3-saddle Telecaster, and then I just create an arc across the width that mimics the radius of the fingerboard. But right now I'm just doing a rough adjustment, and then I'm going to get in, tune it to pitch, balance the trem, and check each individual string. Without getting into every single detail about a setup, once it's strung to pitch, if it has a trem on it or a vibrato, I like to balance that to get it where I want. A Stratocaster, you can have it set to where it is flush to the body, or you could have it like the factory does in the back of the bridge, be up off the body. I need to balance that because it does affect the action. I'll get in and adjust the truss rod where I want it, then get in and precisely set the action, and then go through the intonation. And I repeat that process because as I adjust the action, the neck could move a little bit, readjust the truss rod, then go back to the action, and then the intonation. So they're all interrelated. This guitar turned out really, really well. I knew it was a bit of a diamond in the rough, and it sold very quickly. It was a nice guitar, and I hope the new owner is enjoying it.